The verb ir in Spanish means to go, which is actually one of the trickiest and hardest verbs to work with, but in this video, I'll simplify its principle to its most understandable way. At first, there are a few rules you should know about the verb to go in English so that you can utilize its principle and apply it to Spanish. The very first thing you should know about the verb to go is that it can use the present simple and the present progressive, which actually generates two different meanings in context. For instance, saying I go indicates that I'm a person who likes to go in general, whereas saying I'm going means that I'm going right now, and so my action will change in the future. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because in English, these two phrases generate completely different meanings. However, because the verb ir is irregular in Spanish, it does not have a notion of the present progressive, and therefore, its principle uses both the present simple and the present progressive in unison, and it's something I'll cover in a few minutes from now. The second thing you should know about the verb to go is that there is a big difference between using to go as to go and to go to. For instance, I can say a sentence like I go there or I'm going with my friends, and these phrases don't have the preposition to because these are generic phrases that express ambiguity. On the other hand, I can say phrases like I'm going to the store or I'm going to the class, which uses the preposition to indicate a specific destination. Additionally, you can include infinitives with the preposition to, and these sentences are actually used way more often than the other ones. You can say phrases like I'm going to do my homework or I'm going to read this book, which utilize the preposition to with an infinitive, which indicates an action that will be done in the close future. Overall, the syntax of to go is easy to remember in English because go stays go for 5 pronouns and only adds an es for the he, she, it pronoun. However, learning this verb in Spanish requires a bit more thinking and analysis. At first, the verb to go in Spanish means ir, and it's actually a very strange and irregular verb because it's a monosyllabic verb. Monosyllabic verbs in Spanish basically means that the word has only one syllable, and so the language does not allow a normal conjugation pattern to be used with these words. If you want to conjugate a verb in Spanish, it has to end in ar, er, or ir. You have to drop the ending and then add the ending that corresponds to every pronoun. Similarly, the same can be done with infinitives that slightly get modified in the present progressive, such as adding ando if a verb ends in ar or iendo if the verb ends in er or ir. Because ir is a monosyllabic verb, Spanish does not allow this verb to use any of the following principles that I just covered. So instead, it decides to use a different modification pattern that completely doesn't correspond with the verb ir itself. And speaking of monosyllabic verbs that follow irregular patterns, I've actually covered a verb like that in one of my previous videos, and that is the verb ser. The verb ser is a monosyllabic verb, so it's irregular, following a conjugation pattern that doesn't relate to the word ser itself. Whereas with the verb estar, you do have conjugations that follow the normal syntax of verbs ending in ar that drop the ending and then add the corresponding ending to every pronoun. Nonetheless, the verb ir has the same principle as the verb ser, where its conjugations don't relate to the verb ir. Technically speaking, ir does not even have an ending, and therefore you cannot drop its ending or add endings that correspond to every pronoun, both in the present simple and the present progressive, which might explain why Spanish creates a completely different syntax for this verb. The pronunciation goes as follows: Yo voy, I go, tú vas, you go, él or ellos said, he goes, nosotros vamos, we go, vosotros vais, y'all go, and ellos van, they go. With the verb ir, I recommend that you actually focus on every pronoun besides vosotros because the phrases that you can make with them will be very useful and practical. The first rule that I've mentioned with to go in the beginning of the video was that it can be used as I go and I am going, which creates different meanings in context. However, as I said with the verb ir, Spanish doesn't allow this verb to be used in the present progressive, which changes the meaning of its context by making it use the present simple and the present progressive at the same time. In other words, whenever you decide to use ir in a sentence, like saying yo voy, this phrase simultaneously means I go and I am going. And the same principle applies to the rest of the pronouns. In English, both phrases have different meanings, but in Spanish, it means the same thing, which is also part of the reason why Spanish students struggle with this verb whenever they learn English. More than less, I am going is more of a sophisticated way of speaking in context, so basically, yo voy is used more as I'm going rather than I go. And you can make sentences like I go there, or I'm going with my friends, which in Spanish would be yo voy ahí and yo voy con mis amigos, which shows that voy stays voy in both sentences in Spanish, but in English, you have I go and I am going. And the same principle applies to the rest of the pronouns. And here, we get to the last rule of ir, which is something I've mentioned at the beginning of the video, and that is the difference between to go and to go to. In English, you can have phrases like I'm going to the store or I'm going to the class, both of which use the preposition to indicate a specific destination. Likewise, you can use the preposition to with infinitives, like I'm going to do my homework or I'm going to read this book, which indicates an action that you will do eventually. The way that this principle works in Spanish is by using a conjugation of ir, like yo voy, and then adding the preposition a at the end, which literally means to. If you want to say I'm going to the store or I'm going to the class, you will say yo voy a la tienda or yo voy a la clase. And with these sentences, you're using the preposition to specify destination. On the other hand, you can do the same with infinitives, like saying I'm going to do my homework or I'm going to read this book, which will be yo voy a hacer mi tarea or yo voy a leer este libro. With these sentences, you're using the preposition to by applying it to the verb ir itself. And the same principle applies to any pronouns you want to use, but keep in mind the difference between to go and to go to. If you want to say a phrase like you're going to work, you will say tú vas a trabajar, which will use the preposition to. If you want to say he goes to my house, you will say él va a mi casa. If you want to say a sentence like we go there with everybody, you'll say nosotros vamos ahí con todos, which does not use the preposition to. If you want to say a sentence like they're going to the university, you will say ellos van a la universidad. Overall, I would say that the verb ir is an extremely useful verb in Spanish, even more so than poder and hacer, especially when you're trying to communicate with people who speak Spanish and tell them what you're trying to do or where you go. To use one of my examples from sophomore high, I once had a Spanish teacher that forced everybody to say puedo yo ir al baño in Spanish in case anybody wanted to go to the bathroom, and this phrase literally means can I go to the bathroom? And as you can see, this sentence uses a conjugation of poder in the yo pronoun and uses ir as an infinitive that doesn't change form. Sometimes, students like to go to the bathroom without saying anything to the teacher, and she would always ask them a dónde vas, which literally means to where are you going? And students replied with yo voy al baño, which means I'm going to the bathroom. With these types of phrases, you can create examples similar to this and actually practice whenever you want, and with more practice, you'll be able to freely use the verb ir in any context. This has been the verb ir in Spanish. Thank you for watching this video, and hopefully I made your learning just a bit simpler.